Richard Sterling stood on the balcony of his penthouse, 62 floors above Manhattan, holding a glass of champagne he believed he had earned with 30 years of sacrifice. Beside him stood a woman who was not his wife, her hand resting on his arm as if she already owned a piece of him. Below them, the city lights blinked like witnesses who had seen this story before and knew exactly how it would end. Richard raised his glass toward a room full of board members, investors, and old friends who had come to celebrate the $2 billion merger that would make Sterling Dynamics one of the largest private companies in the country. He smiled the smile of a man who thought he had won everything a lifetime could offer. What Richard Sterling did not know, standing there in his $3,000 suit, was that his wife had already taken it all. 3 hours earlier, in a quiet office across town, his pregnant wife had signed a single document that would end everything Richard believed he owned. She signed it calmly, without tears, without hesitation, the way a woman signs something she has been preparing to sign for months. By the time midnight arrived, Richard Sterling would not have a company. He would not have a fortune. He would not even have the illusion he had been living inside for the past year. And the woman celebrating beside him, the one he thought loved him for exactly who he was, had no idea what was coming either. This is not just a story about betrayal. This is a story about two people who underestimated the same woman at the exact same time and paid for it in ways neither of them could have imagined. Before we go further into how this night actually unfolded, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Richard Sterling ended up on that balcony, celebrating a fortune he no longer owned, you have to go back nearly 3 decades to a much smaller office in Hartford, Connecticut, where a 24-year-old Richard first sat behind his father's old desk. Sterling Dynamics back then was not an empire. It was a struggling industrial parts supplier with 12 employees and a bank loan that kept his father awake most nights. Richard's father, a stern man named Walter Sterling, had built the company from nothing after returning from military service, and he raised his only son to believe that weakness was the one thing that could never be forgiven in business or in life. Richard absorbed that lesson so completely that by the time his father passed, he had already rebuilt the company's client base twice over, working 18-hour days that left little room for anything or anyone else. By his early 40s, Richard had turned a regional parts supplier into a diversified holding company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, with divisions in manufacturing, logistics, and technology licensing. Business magazines called him a visionary. Employees called him demanding. Competitors called him ruthless, though always with a tone of grudging respect. What none of them knew was that Richard had built an entire identity around never being caught off guard, never being the one left behind, never being made to feel powerless the way he had felt as a boy watching his father struggle to keep the lights on in their small office. Every deal he closed, every company he acquired, was Richard proving to a version of himself that no longer existed, that he would never be small again. It was this exact belief that he could never be outmaneuvered that would eventually become his greatest blind spot. Walter Sterling had been more than just demanding. He had been methodical, paranoid even, about protecting what he built. Friends from that era remember Walter constantly warning Richard about the dangers of mixing business with personal relationships. A business, Walter would say, often late at night in that small Hartford office, can survive bad markets and bad luck, but it rarely survives bad marriages. Walter had watched too many of his competitors lose their companies in messy divorces throughout the 1970s and 80s, and he was determined that Sterling Dynamics would never face the same fate. This obsession would lead Walter to create something unusual when he restructured the company's ownership in the early 1990s, something his son would not fully understand until it was far too late. The trust document Walter created in 1993, just 2 years before his death, was nearly 200 pages of dense legal language that Richard, then 32 years old and eager to prove himself worthy of eventual leadership, signed without reading completely. His father's attorney at the time, a meticulous man named Harold Whitfield, had actually tried to walk Richard through the entire document page by page, but Richard, confident in his father's judgment and impatient to get back to the actual work of running the business, had waved off the explanation. "If my father drafted it, I trust it," Richard had said. scrawling his signature across multiple pages marked with small adhesive arrows indicating signature lines. Harold Whitfield remembered that moment clearly, decades later, because he had paused before witnessing the signature, looking at the young Richard Sterling and wondering if he should insist on a full explanation. He did not. It was a decision Harold would think about often in the years to come. Buried within that trust document, on page 147, was the infidelity forfeiture clause that Walter Sterling had insisted on including despite his attorney's gentle suggestion that such provisions were unnecessarily harsh and potentially difficult to enforce. Walter had been adamant. He had watched his closest business partner, a man named Robert Chen, lose a manufacturing company worth nearly $8 million in a divorce triggered by an affair with his secretary, a scandal that had dominated Hartford business circles for years. Walter vowed that no Sterling would ever be vulnerable to the same fate. The clause stated, in language that left little room for interpretation, that if either spouse in a Sterling family marriage engaged in proven marital infidelity, their voting shares in Sterling Dynamics would automatically transfer into an irrevocable trust established for any existing or future children, removing the unfaithful spouse's controlling interest entirely, regardless of what separate divorce proceedings might determine regarding other marital assets. What made this clause particularly unusual was that it did not require a court trial or even a divorce filing to activate. It simply required documented proof of infidelity, submitted to the trust's designated legal administrator, and a formal declaration from the non-offending spouse triggering the transfer. Walter had specifically structured it this way to prevent the kind of lengthy, public court battles that had destroyed Robert Chen's company through negative publicity and investor uncertainty long before the divorce itself was even finalized. Walter Sterling wanted consequences that were swift, certain, and completely outside the control of whichever Sterling might eventually violate their marriage vows. At the time he drafted this clause, Walter likely imagined he was protecting his son. He never considered that he might eventually be providing Richard's future wife with the most powerful weapon she could possibly need. Victoria Hale entered Richard's life at a charity gala in Boston, back when she was 29 and working as a corporate attorney for one of the top firms in the state. She had not been invited to impress anyone that night. She had been invited because her firm represented one of the event sponsors, and she was simply doing her job, reviewing a sponsorship contract on her phone in the corner of the room while everyone else mingled with champagne in hand. Richard noticed her before she noticed him, not because of how she looked, though she was undeniably striking, but because she was the only person in the room who seemed completely unimpressed by the surroundings. When he introduced himself, she barely looked up from her phone. "Give me 1 second," she said. "I'm finishing something." Richard Sterling, a man used to rooms going silent when he walked in, found himself waiting. That single moment told Richard everything he thought he needed to know about Victoria Hale. She was sharp. She was unbothered by money or status. She noticed details other people missed, the kind of details that could make or break a multi-million-dollar deal. In fact, later that same evening, Victoria pointed out a clause buried in the sponsorship contract that would have cost the event organizers nearly $200,000 if left unchanged. Richard was fascinated. Here was a woman who read contracts the way other people read novels, searching for the sentence that changed everything. He asked her to dinner. She said she was busy for the next 3 weeks. He asked what night worked. She said none of them, but if he wanted to discuss actual business, her office had openings on Tuesdays. Richard laughed for the first time in months. What Richard did not know about Victoria Hale was that her ability to read contracts for hidden dangers was not simply a professional skill. It was a survival mechanism she had developed growing up in a household where agreements, whether spoken or written, were frequently violated without consequence. Victoria's father had been a small-time real estate developer in Providence, Rhode Island, a man charming enough to secure partnerships and loans he never had any intention of honoring fully. Victoria had spent her childhood watching her father talk his way out of failed developments, broken promises, and angry investors who had trusted the wrong clauses in poorly written agreements. By the time she was 16, Victoria had learned something that would shape her entire adult life. The people who win are not necessarily the smartest or the most honest. They are the people who read the documents most carefully and understand exactly which signatures actually matter. Victoria put herself through college and law school working 3 jobs simultaneously, graduating second in her class from Boston College Law School with scholarship assistance and a determination never to be the person caught off guard by language buried in a contract she should have read more carefully. Her first job at Morrison & Fitch, one of Boston's most prestigious corporate law firms, had been brutally competitive, filled with brilliant young attorneys all fighting for the same partnership track positions. Victoria distinguished herself not through flashy courtroom victories, but through her almost supernatural ability to find problems in contracts before they became lawsuits, saving clients millions in potential litigation costs by catching dangerous clauses during the negotiation phase rather than the damage control phase. Partners at Morrison & Fitch began requesting Victoria specifically for their most complex contract reviews, trusting her eye for detail more than attorneys with twice her experience. By the time she met Richard Sterling at that charity gala, Victoria had been practicing law for 7 years and had already turned down 2 partnership offers from competing firms, both of which would have required even longer hours than the 70-hour weeks she was already working. She was exhausted, successful, and quietly uncertain whether the career she had built was actually the life she wanted to live for the next 30 years. Richard appeared in her life at exactly that moment of uncertainty, representing something she had not seriously considered before. The possibility of building a life that was not entirely defined by reviewing other people's contracts in a windowless office until 9 o'clock every night. Their relationship developed slowly, built more on mutual respect than romantic urgency, which was unusual for a man like Richard, who was used to relationships moving at the speed of his ambition. Victoria never seemed dazzled by his private jet or his growing real estate portfolio. When he mentioned his net worth during one of their early dinners, almost testing her reaction, she simply asked him a question about his company's debt-to-equity ratio, completely bypassing the number he had shared like it meant nothing at all. It took Richard nearly a year to realize that Victoria's lack of interest in his wealth was not a strategy to seem unimpressed. She genuinely did not care about the number. She cared about how he built it, whether it was built on solid ground, and whether the man behind it was someone worth trusting with more than just business decisions. Richard had never met anyone quite like her, someone who seemed to evaluate relationships with the same careful precision she brought to contract negotiations, and paradoxically, that carefulness made him trust her more than he had ever trusted anyone in his personal life. They married 4 years after that gala, in a small ceremony that Victoria insisted stay under 100 guests, despite Richard's instinct to turn it into a corporate showcase. The wedding itself took place at a small estate in the Berkshires, far from the Manhattan social circles where Richard usually operated. Victoria's family, what remained of it after her father's death 2 years earlier, filled barely 3 rows of chairs. Richard's side was dominated by business associates and board members, men in expensive suits who treated the wedding reception like a networking opportunity. Victoria noticed, even on her wedding day, how many of Richard's oldest friends made jokes about prenuptial agreements during their toasts, assuming that someone marrying a man as wealthy as Richard must have been primarily motivated by financial security. She smiled through those toasts, said nothing, and filed the comments away in the same mental space where she cataloged things that revealed more about the speaker than they realized. Victoria continued practicing law for the first 2 years of their marriage, turning down partnership offers twice because she wanted flexibility rather than another 80-hour workweek added to the household. Richard, to his credit, never pressured her to quit working entirely, though he did frequently mention how helpful it would be to have someone he trusted managing the family's private investments and philanthropic foundation, work that could be done on her own schedule without the relentless demands of a law firm partnership. Slowly, at Richard's gentle but consistent urging, Victoria stepped back from her legal career entirely, taking on a quieter role helping manage the family's private investments and philanthropic foundation instead. It seemed, from the outside, like the natural next chapter for a successful power couple. What almost no one considered, including Richard himself, was that Victoria had spent nearly a decade being trained to read contracts for hidden dangers, and stepping back from her career did not mean she had stopped reading. In fact, one of the first things Victoria did after officially leaving Morrison & Fitch was request copies of all the family trust documents and corporate governance agreements related to Sterling Dynamics, telling Richard she wanted to understand their complete financial picture now that she was managing their private investments. Richard, pleased that his wife was taking such an active interest in the family business, provided her with complete access to every document she requested, including the original trust document his father had created in 1993, the same document Richard himself had never read completely. Victoria spent 3 full weeks reviewing that 200-page trust document, taking notes in the same meticulous fashion she had once used to review multi-million-dollar acquisition agreements for Morrison and Fitch clients. It was during that review that she first discovered the infidelity forfeiture clause on page 147, and though she had no reason to believe it would ever become relevant to her own marriage, she noted its existence the way she noted everything potentially significant, carefully, with full understanding of its implications, filed away for reference should circumstances ever change. The first 6 years of their marriage were, by most accounts, genuinely happy ones. Richard traveled constantly for business, but he always made time for their anniversary, always remembered the details Victoria mentioned in passing months earlier, always seemed proud, in his own controlled way, to introduce her as his wife rather than simply an accessory to his success. Friends who knew the couple described Victoria as the only person who could challenge Richard in a conversation without him becoming defensive, the only person whose opinion could actually change his mind mid-argument. For a man who prided himself on never being outmaneuvered, that kind of respect was rare and by most accounts, genuine. But somewhere around year 7, subtle cracks began appearing in the foundation of a marriage everyone assumed was solid, cracks that started long before anyone, including Victoria herself, had proof of anything at all. It began with small things that most spouses might have dismissed as normal stress from an expanding business. Richard started taking calls in another room, something he had never done before. Business trips that used to last 3 days began stretching to 5 or 6, with vague explanations about client dinners and negotiation delays that seemed reasonable enough on the surface. Victoria noticed, the way she noticed everything, but she said nothing at first, filing each small inconsistency away the same way she used to flag suspicious clauses in a 300-page contract. A changed password on his laptop, a new cologne she had not purchased for him, receipts for dinners at restaurants in neighborhoods he had no business reason to visit. Individually, each detail could have been innocent. Collectively, they formed a pattern that Victoria recognized immediately, though she was not yet ready to act on what the pattern suggested. It was around this same time that Sterling Dynamics hired a new vice president of marketing, a 29-year-old woman named Amber Lane, who had come from a competing firm with an impressive resume and an even more impressive ability to charm every room she entered. Richard hired her personally, overriding 2 other candidates the hiring committee had preferred, citing her aggressive vision for brand expansion as the deciding factor. Victoria met Amber for the first time at a company event 3 weeks after her hiring and noticed immediately the way Amber looked at Richard, with an intensity that went beyond professional admiration. More telling was the way Richard looked back, with a warmth Victoria had not seen him direct at any other employee in the 7 years they had been married. Victoria spent exactly 12 minutes making polite conversation with Amber Lane that evening, and walked away certain that something between her husband and this new executive had either already begun or would begin soon. Most wives in Victoria's position might have confronted their husband immediately, demanding answers based on intuition and subtle behavioral changes that were concerning but not yet conclusive. Victoria did not. She understood something fundamental about confrontation. Done too early, it gives the other party time to hide evidence, construct better lies, and become more careful about future deception. Victoria had spent years watching opposing counsel make exactly that mistake in contract disputes, revealing their concerns before they had gathered enough evidence to make those concerns undeniable. She was not going to repeat their error. Instead, Victoria began what she later described to her mentor Harold Whitfield as a quiet documentation phase. Treating her marriage like a contract dispute, she was building evidence to support, methodically and without emotion. She started by simply paying closer attention to details she had previously taken at face value. When Richard mentioned a business trip to Chicago, Victoria began verifying whether Sterling Dynamics actually had client meetings scheduled in Chicago during those dates, using her access to the company's internal calendar system under the reasonable pretense of managing their personal schedule around his professional commitments. When Richard mentioned working late with Amber on a new marketing campaign, Victoria began noting the specific times he arrived home, cross-referencing them against the building's security logs that she could access as the CEO's spouse. She did all of this quietly, carefully, never once revealing to Richard that his explanations were being independently verified rather than simply accepted. For 3 months, Victoria built a timeline of inconsistencies that was concerning but still not conclusive, not the kind of evidence that would hold up to serious scrutiny if she were forced to present it. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening in early spring, when Victoria, already 3 months pregnant with their first child, found a hotel receipt in the inside pocket of Richard's jacket while dropping it off at the dry cleaners herself, something she almost never did but had volunteered for that particular evening after their regular housekeeper called in sick. The receipt was from the Carlisle, a boutique hotel less than 20 minutes from their home in Greenwich, dated the same weekend Richard had claimed to be at a manufacturing conference in Chicago. Victoria stood in their walk-in closet for nearly 10 minutes, staring at a small piece of paper that confirmed a suspicion she had been quietly building for months. The receipt showed a 2-night stay in a junior suite, with room service charges that clearly indicated 2 people dining together both evenings, and a checkout time of 11:47 on Sunday morning, hours after Richard had called her from what he claimed was O'Hare Airport, apologizing that his flight home was delayed due to weather. Victoria did not cry. She did not confront Richard that night, or the next night, or even the following week. Instead, she folded the receipt carefully, photographed it with her phone to create a digital backup, placed the original inside a small lockbox in her home office, and began doing what she had always done best. She began building a case. But Victoria understood that evidence of a single hotel stay, while damning in the context of a marriage, was not yet the kind of comprehensive, undeniable proof she would need if she wanted to activate that forfeiture clause she had discovered years earlier in the trust document. She needed more than one receipt. She needed a pattern of behavior so well documented that Richard would have no ability to explain it away as a misunderstanding or a one-time mistake. She needed the kind of case file that would leave no room for doubt, no opportunity for negotiation, and no possibility that a family court judge might find her evidence insufficient to warrant the extraordinary remedy the trust allowed. That is when Victoria made the decision that would ultimately determine how this entire story unfolded. She hired a private investigator. Most wives in Victoria's position might have hired a divorce attorney immediately, or confronted their husband in a moment of raw emotion, demanding answers before the anger cooled into strategy. Victoria did neither. She understood something that Richard, for all his business brilliance, seemed to have forgotten completely. Information gathered too early can be dismissed, argued away, or hidden more carefully the second time. Information gathered patiently, over months, becomes something far more dangerous. It becomes undeniable. So Victoria began her own quiet investigation, starting with a private investigator named Diane Cross, a former financial crimes detective who now specialized in exactly this kind of work, corporate infidelity cases that often revealed far more than just an affair. Victoria met Diane at a coffee shop nearly 40 minutes outside Greenwich, in a small Connecticut town where she was unlikely to be recognized by anyone in Richard's business or social circles. She used a name that was not her own for the initial consultation, paid in cash for the first 3 months of their arrangement, and provided Diane with a level of detail about Richard's schedule, habits, and business operations that immediately told the investigator she was working with someone who understood exactly how evidence needed to be gathered to be legally useful later. Diane Cross had been in this business for nearly 15 years, and she could always tell within the first 30 minutes of meeting a client whether they were hiring her out of paranoid suspicion or legitimate concern based on actual evidence. Victoria Sterling, despite using a fake name, clearly fell into the second category. "I need you to document everything," Victoria told Diane during that first meeting, sliding a folder across the table that contained copies of Richard's recent travel schedules, credit card statements Victoria had quietly photographed, and a list of dates when Richard's explanations for his whereabouts had not matched the documented facts. "I don't need you to prove my husband is having an affair. I already know he is. I need you to document it thoroughly enough that it cannot be disputed later, and I need you to do it in a way that will hold up if this evidence is ever submitted to a legal administrator or reviewed by a judge." Diane nodded slowly. recognizing immediately that she was not dealing with an emotional spouse looking for closure, but rather an attorney, even a former one, building a legal case with the same precision she would bring to any other litigation strategy. What Diane Cross uncovered over the following months went far beyond a simple affair between a CEO and his marketing executive. Surveillance photographs confirmed Richard and Amber were indeed involved romantically, meeting at hotels roughly twice a month, always careful, always using separate entrances and staggered arrival times. The Carlisle, where Victoria had found the first receipt, appeared to be their regular location, though they occasionally varied the venue, likely as a counter-surveillance measure Richard had probably read about in some airport business book about protecting corporate secrets. Diane documented 17 separate meetings over a 5-month period, each one photographed, time-stamped, and cross-referenced against Richard's claimed business schedule to show the clear pattern of deception involved. But buried within Diane's financial background research, something Victoria had specifically requested beyond simple surveillance, was something Victoria had not expected to find. A series of wire transfers, totaling just over $4 million, moving from a Sterling Dynamics subsidiary account into an offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands under a corporate name that had no obvious connection to any legitimate Sterling Dynamics business operation. The transfers had been made over an 18-month period, always in amounts just below the federal reporting threshold that would have triggered automatic scrutiny, and timed suspiciously close to several major stock purchases made just days before Sterling Dynamics announced positive earnings reports that drove the company's share price significantly higher. Victoria, still fluent in the language of financial law from her years as a corporate attorney, recognized the pattern immediately. This was not simply an unfaithful husband. This was potential securities fraud, insider trading dressed up in the language of routine corporate transfers. Someone, either Richard himself or someone very close to him with access to both company accounts and advanced knowledge of material non-public information, was systematically profiting from stock purchases made immediately before positive announcements that would naturally drive prices upward. Victoria stared at Diane's financial report for nearly an hour, sitting alone in her home office while Richard was away on another unexplained business trip, understanding that what she was holding was far more dangerous than simple evidence of marital infidelity. This discovery forced Victoria to make a decision that would require more legal sophistication than emotional processing. If she took the insider trading evidence directly to federal regulators, she would likely trigger an SEC investigation that could destroy Sterling Dynamics entirely, costing not just Richard his fortune, but potentially thousands of employees their jobs and investors their retirement savings. The company her husband had spent 30 years building could be dismantled through criminal prosecution, leaving nothing for Victoria to protect for their unborn child except the legal fees and public scandal that would follow. But if she used what she knew more carefully, she might be able to protect the company itself while still ensuring Richard faced consequences proportional to what he had actually done, both personally and financially. Victoria quietly reached out to her old law school mentor, Harold Whitfield, the same attorney who had helped draft the original Sterling family trust documents decades earlier when Richard's father Walter was still alive. She contacted Harold using a prepaid phone she had purchased specifically for communications she did not want traced back to her regular devices, and arranged a meeting at his semi-retired office in a modest building far from the Manhattan legal district where she might have been recognized. When Harold answered his office door and saw Victoria standing there, visibly pregnant, and carrying a briefcase she clearly had not wanted to bring to his office through normal channels, he knew immediately that whatever she was about to discuss involved the Sterling family in ways that were not going to be simple. "I need to understand something about the trust Walter created," Victoria said quietly, once Harold had closed his office door and confirmed they were completely alone. "The infidelity forfeiture clause on page 147. If I can prove Richard violated his marriage vows, does the trust actually allow me to activate that clause even if I don't file for divorce immediately? Can I trigger the share transfer while staying legally married to him?" Harold Whitfield sat down slowly, understanding immediately the sophistication of what Victoria was actually asking. She was not asking whether she had grounds for divorce. She was asking whether the trust mechanism could be used independent of divorce proceedings, allowing her to strip Richard of corporate control while maintaining the legal structure of their marriage intact, at least temporarily, to avoid the kind of public scandal that might destabilize the company before she was ready to act. Harold spent the next 3 hours walking Victoria through the exact legal mechanics of how Walter Sterling's trust actually functioned, explaining details that Richard himself had never bothered to fully understand when he signed the document decades earlier. The infidelity forfeiture clause, Harold explained, was specifically designed to operate separately from divorce proceedings precisely because Walter had watched too many companies destroyed by lengthy divorce litigation that became public spectacles before the legal issues were even resolved. The clause could be activated by submitting documented proof of infidelity to the trust's designated legal administrator, currently a small firm in Hartford that specialized in family trust management, along with a formal declaration from the non-offending spouse that they were invoking the forfeiture provision. Once activated, the transfer of voting shares would happen automatically, typically within 72 hours, and would be legally irreversible regardless of what any subsequent divorce settlement might determine. So theoretically, Victoria said carefully, if I submitted the evidence I've gathered, along with that formal declaration, I could transfer Richard's controlling shares into a trust for our child before he even knows I'm taking action. Harold nodded slowly. Theoretically, yes. But Victoria, you need to understand what you would be doing. This isn't just changing the ownership structure on paper. You would be taking operational control of a multi-million-dollar company away from the man who built it, and doing so in a way that he would have absolutely no ability to reverse through legal challenge, because he signed the document that allows this transfer to happen. Walter designed this clause to be ruthless specifically so it couldn't be negotiated away later. If you activate it, Richard will lose control of Sterling Dynamics permanently. Are you prepared for what that means, not just for him, but for you and your child? Victoria sat in Harold Whitfield's office for a long time, her hand resting unconsciously on her pregnant belly, thinking through implications that extended far beyond simple revenge for a betrayed marriage. She was not thinking about hurting Richard, though she would be lying if she claimed that held no appeal at all. She was thinking about her daughter, the child growing inside her, who would soon be born into a family where her father had demonstrated through his actions that his word, his vows, and his legal obligations meant less to him than his own immediate desires. Victoria had grown up watching her own father treat agreements as temporary conveniences, and she had promised herself long before meeting Richard Sterling that she would never raise a child in a household where breaking your word carried no real consequences. Yes, Victoria finally said, I'm prepared, but I need to do this correctly, which means timing matters. Richard is about to close the largest merger in Sterling Dynamics history. If I activate the forfeiture clause before that merger completes, the ownership chaos could kill the deal entirely, costing the company and its shareholders hundreds of millions in value. I need to wait until the merger closes and his shares reach their maximum value, then activate the clause immediately afterward, before he has any chance to restructure ownership or move assets in ways that might complicate the transfer. Harold Whitfield looked at the woman sitting across from him, 7 months pregnant, and calmly discussing corporate merger timing like a seasoned M&A attorney, and realized that Richard Sterling had made the single greatest mistake of his professional life. He had underestimated his own wife so completely that he had never considered she might be capable of thinking several steps ahead of him. Over the following 4 months, Victoria lived what could only be described as a double life, though one far more subtle than the affair her husband was conducting in hotels across Connecticut and New York. To Richard, to their friends, to everyone in their social circle, Victoria appeared to be simply a pregnant woman settling into the quiet final months before childbirth, attending fewer social events, spending more time at home preparing the nursery, becoming, as Richard himself described her to colleagues, wonderfully low maintenance, during a period when his attention was consumed almost entirely by merger negotiations. What none of them saw was the woman who spent 3 hours every Tuesday afternoon in Harold Whitfield's modest Hartford office, methodically preparing every document required to activate the trust forfeiture clause the moment she chose to file it. The legal preparation was extraordinarily detailed, requiring not just the surveillance evidence Diane Cross had gathered, but also formal affidavits from witnesses who could confirm dates and times, financial documentation showing the pattern of Richard's deceptive behavior, and a carefully constructed timeline that would allow the trust administrator to verify every claim Victoria was making without requiring her to testify publicly or subject herself to the kind of cross-examination that might complicate the transfer. Harold worked with Victoria to anticipate every possible legal challenge Richard's attorneys might attempt to raise once the forfeiture clause was activated, and to ensure that the evidence file she submitted would be so thoroughly documented that no challenge would succeed in reversing the share transfer once it occurred. But beyond the legal preparation, Victoria also had to prepare herself emotionally for what she was about to do, which in some ways was more difficult than managing the legal complexity. She was not simply ending a marriage or punishing a betrayal. She was about to systematically dismantle the professional identity of a man she had once loved, possibly still loved in some complicated way, using legal mechanisms he had forgotten existed until the moment they destroyed everything he had spent his adult life building. There were nights when Victoria lay awake, feeling her daughter moving inside her, wondering whether she was doing the right thing or simply executing an act of revenge so sophisticated that she had convinced herself it was justified by legal technicalities rather than driven by the same base emotions that motivated any betrayed spouse. Those doubts never lasted long. Victoria would think about Amber Lane, young and confident, and casually destroying someone else's marriage because it served her professional ambitions, and Victoria would feel her resolve harden again. She would think about those offshore wire transfers, representing millions of dollars moved through corporate accounts in patterns that suggested Richard believed the rules that applied to other people somehow did not apply to him. And she would remember why she had decided to act rather than simply file for divorce and walk away with half of everything. This was not just about infidelity. This was about a man who had become so convinced of his own untouchability that he had forgotten the most basic lesson his own father had tried to teach him. That weakness is not making mistakes, but rather believing you are too powerful for mistakes to have consequences. During this same period, Richard's behavior became increasingly careless in ways that suggested he had convinced himself that Victoria either did not notice or did not care about his affair with Amber. He stopped being careful about hiding hotel receipts. He stopped explaining in detail where he was going when he left the house for hours at a time. He began mentioning Amber's name in casual conversation without any apparent awareness that the frequency with which he brought her up might seem unusual to his pregnant wife. Friends who saw Richard during this period later described him as almost giddy, behaving like a man who believed he had successfully balanced two completely separate lives and was proud of his ability to manage both simultaneously without either one falling apart. He seemed to genuinely believe he was getting away with something. The merger negotiations, meanwhile, were reaching their final stages. Sterling Dynamics was preparing to merge with Consolidated Logistics International, a deal that had been in development for nearly 18 months and would create one of the largest privately held logistics and manufacturing companies in the country, valued at just over $2 billion. Richard had personally negotiated most of the deal structure, working 14-hour days that left him exhausted but triumphant, believing this merger represented the crowning achievement of a career that had transformed his father's small parts supplier into a genuine corporate empire. He had already begun planning the celebration that would mark the merger's official closing, a lavish party at his penthouse that would showcase not just his professional success, but also, though he did not say this explicitly to Victoria, his new life with Amber Lane. What Richard did not know, could not have known, was that his wife had coordinated the timing of her legal filing to occur exactly 15 minutes after the merger's scheduled closing time, ensuring that his shares would reach their maximum value in the combined entity before the forfeiture clause transferred them out of his control entirely. Victoria had spent weeks working with Harold to confirm the exact sequence of events that would need to unfold. The merger would close at 6 o'clock on a Friday evening, the scheduled time built into months of regulatory filings and legal documentation. Victoria would sign the forfeiture declaration at 6:15, the moment the merger was legally final and Richard's shares had converted to their new, significantly more valuable form in the merged company. Harold would file the declaration with the trust administrator by 6:30, triggering the automatic transfer process that would strip Richard of his controlling interest before he even finished his first champagne toast at the celebration scheduled to begin at 7. As the final week before the merger closing arrived, Victoria moved through her daily routine with a calmness that surprised even her. She had breakfast with Richard on Wednesday morning, listening to him excitedly describe the details of the party he had planned for Friday night, which guests he had invited, which board members would be attending. She smiled and asked appropriate questions and gave absolutely no indication that she had spent the previous afternoon in Harold Whitfield's office, reviewing for the final time the exact wording of the declaration she would sign 48 hours later. Richard kissed her goodbye that morning with what seemed like genuine affection, told her he would try to be home early, and left for his office completely unaware that he was living through the final days of the only life he had ever really known. On Friday afternoon, Victoria dressed carefully for the evening's celebration, choosing a navy maternity dress that was elegant but not ostentatious, appropriate for a CEO's wife attending a major corporate event. She did her makeup in the mirror of their master bathroom, thinking about the fact that this would likely be the last time she prepared for a Sterling Dynamics event as Richard's wife in anything more than the most technical legal sense. At 4:30, she told Richard she had a quick appointment with her doctor, just a routine checkup that had been scheduled weeks earlier, and that she would meet him at the penthouse around 7:15 after the initial group of guests had arrived. Richard, distracted by last-minute merger details and party preparations, barely looked up from his phone when she left, simply nodding and reminding her to text him when she was on her way. Victoria drove to Harold Whitfield's office, parked in the small lot behind the building, and walked inside carrying the same briefcase she had brought to their first meeting months earlier. Harold had already prepared every document, needing only Victoria's signature on the final declaration to set everything in motion. They sat together in his office, not speaking much, as Victoria reviewed one final time the document that would legally activate the forfeiture clause. The language was simple, almost stark in its directness. I, Victoria and Sterling, hereby formally declare that Richard James Sterling has violated the terms of our marriage through documented infidelity, and I invoke the forfeiture provision contained in Article 7, Section 4 of the Sterling Family Trust, requesting immediate transfer of all affected voting shares as specified therein. Victoria signed her name at exactly 6:17 in the evening, 2 minutes after Harold confirmed via email from the Sterling Dynamics legal team that the merger had officially closed. Harold witnessed her signature, made copies of the complete evidence file that would be submitted to the trust administrator, and told Victoria something he had been waiting months to say. Walter Sterling would be proud of you. He created this clause because he believed consequences should be certain and swift when people violate the agreements that matter most. You're using it exactly the way he intended, to protect the company and your child rather than to simply punish your husband. That takes remarkable discipline. Victoria nodded slowly, not entirely certain she deserved the compliment, but understanding that Harold was trying, in his own formal way, to tell her that what she was about to do was legally sound, even if it would be emotionally devastating for everyone involved. She left Harold's office at 6:45 and drove toward the penthouse where Richard's celebration was already well underway, knowing that several floors above her, in a room full of board members and investors toasting his greatest professional achievement, her husband had absolutely no idea that the life he had been celebrating for the past hour no longer belonged to him. Richard Sterling stood on the balcony of his penthouse that evening feeling exactly the way he had always imagined he would feel at the pinnacle of his career, successful, vindicated, surrounded by people who respected what he had built, and standing beside a woman who made him feel young in a way his marriage to Victoria no longer did. Amber Lane looked stunning that evening in a dress that was perhaps slightly too elegant for a marketing executive attending her boss's corporate celebration, but Richard did not care. He wanted her there. He wanted everyone to see them together, though he would not say so explicitly for several more months. After the divorce, he was planning to ask Victoria for some time in the next few weeks, once the chaos of the merger had settled, and he could present it to her as a mutual decision by two people who had simply grown apart rather than an affair that had been ongoing for nearly a year. The party was everything Richard had envisioned when he began planning it months earlier. String quartet playing elegant background music, waitstaff circulating with champagne and appetizers that cost more per person than most people spent on an entire dinner. floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Manhattan that reminded everyone in the room exactly how successful you had to be to afford 62 floors of vertical separation from the ordinary people living their ordinary lives far below. Richard moved through the crowd accepting congratulations with the practiced humility of a man who had learned long ago that powerful people are expected to seem gracious about their success, even when they are privately thrilled by it. Everything about the evening was perfect, exactly as Richard had imagined, right up until the moment Peter Hendricks, one of Sterling Dynamics' longest-serving board members, pulled him aside with an expression that suggested something was seriously wrong. "Richard, I need to speak with you privately," Peter said quietly, his tone suggesting this was not a conversation that should happen in front of the other guests. Richard, assuming it was some last-minute merger technicality that needed his attention, excused himself from the group he had been speaking with and followed Peter into his private study, a wood-paneled room down the hallway from where the party continued without them. Peter closed the door carefully and turned to face Richard with an expression somewhere between confusion and concern. "I just received a call from Doug Patterson at the Trust Administration Office in Hartford. He says there's been some kind of filing related to the family trust that's triggering an automatic change in the company's shareholder structure. He tried to explain it to me, but honestly, I think you need to call your personal attorney immediately because I don't fully understand what's happening." Richard's initial reaction was exactly what Peter had expected. Dismissive irritation at what he assumed was some kind of bureaucratic error happening at the worst possible time. "I'm sure it's just some paperwork confusion related to the merger closing. These things happen when you're dealing with complex corporate structures. I'll have my attorney sort it out on Monday." Peter shook his head. "Richard, Doug said this wasn't merger-related. He said it was something called a forfeiture clause in the original family trust, and that your wife filed a declaration this evening triggering an automatic transfer of your controlling shares. He said the transfer would be effective within 72 hours and that the board needed to be notified immediately because it represented a material change in company ownership. I think you need to call someone right now, not Monday." For the first time that evening, Richard felt something close to actual fear. The word forfeiture meant nothing to him in the context of the family trust, a document he had signed so long ago that he barely remembered its contents beyond the basic structure his father had explained decades earlier. He pulled out his phone and called his personal attorney, a man named Harold Pierce who had been representing Richard in various business matters for nearly 15 years. Pierce answered on the second ring, and from the tone of his voice, Richard immediately understood that whatever was happening was far more serious than a simple paperwork error. "Richard, I was just about to call you. I received documentation about an hour ago from the Sterling Family Trust Administrator. We need to meet immediately. This is not something we should discuss over the phone." "Tell me what's happening," Richard said, his voice harder now, the fear beginning to crystallize into anger. Pierce paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Your wife filed a declaration this evening invoking something called an infidelity forfeiture clause in the original trust document your father created in 1993. She submitted what appears to be extensive documentation of an extramarital affair, along with a formal request to activate the clause, which according to the trust language, automatically transfers your voting shares in Sterling Dynamics into an irrevocable trust established for your children, with your wife serving as trustee. Richard, if what she filed is legitimate, and from what I've reviewed so far it appears to be, you just lost controlling interest in your own company. The transfer is already processing. It's not something we can stop through an injunction because you signed the document that allows this transfer to happen automatically once certain conditions are met." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Richard sat down hard in the leather chair behind his desk, still holding his phone, trying to process what he was being told. "That's not possible. I would remember signing something that gave anyone the power to just take my company away from me. My father wouldn't have created something like that." Pierce's voice was patient but firm, the voice of an attorney delivering bad news to a client who does not want to believe what they are hearing. "Your father specifically created this clause after watching a business associate lose his company in a messy divorce in the early 1980s. He included it in the family trust to ensure that marital infidelity would have immediate, certain consequences that couldn't be negotiated away in divorce proceedings. You signed the trust document in 1993, Richard. Your signature is right there on page 147. acknowledging that you read and understood all provisions contained therein. Richard's mind was racing now, trying to remember details from 25 years earlier, trying to recall whether he had actually read that trust document or had simply signed it because his father told him to, because he was young and impatient and trusted his father's judgment more than his own understanding of legal complexity. He could not remember. He genuinely could not remember whether he had ever actually read page 147 of a document he had signed a quarter-century ago. How much documentation did Victoria submit? How does she even know about this clause? Pierce's response was almost admiring despite the devastating news he was delivering. Richard, she submitted over 300 pages of evidence. Surveillance photographs, witness affidavits, credit card records, hotel receipts, all cross-referenced and indexed like a professional litigation file. This isn't an angry wife making accusations. This is an attorney, or someone working with a very good attorney, who spent months building an airtight case before filing anything. Richard ended the call and sat alone in his study for several minutes, staring at nothing, while just beyond the closed door the party he had planned to celebrate the greatest achievement of his professional life continued exactly as scheduled, guests laughing and drinking expensive champagne, completely unaware that the host they were celebrating had just lost everything that made the celebration meaningful. Slowly, like pieces of a puzzle he had never realized he was supposed to be solving, details from the past year began falling into place. Victoria's unusual quietness during her pregnancy, her complete lack of questions about his increasingly frequent absences, the way she had smiled and nodded when he mentioned the party tonight, as if she was simply being supportive rather than waiting for exactly the right moment to activate a legal strategy she had been preparing for months. He had been so certain she did not know, so confident that his careful scheduling of hotel meetings and his use of separate credit cards had protected him from discovery. And all the while, his wife, the woman he had increasingly dismissed as simply his pregnant, undemanding spouse, had been 3 steps ahead of him, building a legal case with the same meticulous precision she had once brought to contract reviews for her law firm clients. Richard had spent his entire adult life priding himself on never being outmaneuvered in business, and he had just been outmaneuvered so completely by his own wife that by the time he understood what was happening, the entire game was already over. Peter Hendricks knocked quietly on the study door. "Richard, is everything all right? Several board members are asking when you'll be coming back out." Richard wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the question. Was everything all right? He had just lost controlling interest in the company he had spent 30 years building. His wife had apparently been documenting his affair for months without him suspecting anything. And he was standing in a room full of people celebrating a merger that had just made him fabulously wealthy in theory, except the shares that represented that wealth were now in a trust controlled by the woman who had just legally destroyed him. No, everything was not all right. Everything was so far from all right that Richard was not even certain how to begin explaining to the people in his living room what had just happened. But he could not stay in his study forever. Eventually, he would have to walk back out into that party and pretend, for another hour or maybe 2, that this was still the greatest night of his professional life. Because the alternative would be explaining to a room full of board members and investors that their CEO had just been voted out of his own company by a trust clause activated by his pregnant wife using evidence of an affair he had been conducting with an employee who was standing in that same room, drinking champagne and wearing a dress that suddenly seemed far too expensive for someone who was about to lose her job along with everything else that was about to come crashing down. Richard stood slowly, straightened his tie, and prepared to walk back into a celebration that had become, without anyone realizing it yet, a wake for the life he used to have. Richard forced himself through another 90 minutes of conversation that felt surreal, accepting congratulations he no longer deserved, smiling for photographs that would later seem like evidence of just how completely he had failed to see what was coming. Amber sensed something was wrong, pulling him aside twice to ask if he was feeling all right. But Richard simply told her he was exhausted from the merger negotiations and would explain everything later. He could not bring himself to tell her the truth, not yet, not while surrounded by people who still believed this evening represented triumph rather than catastrophe. By 10:30, Richard's personal attorney had arrived at the penthouse, interrupting the party with an apologetic expression that immediately told Richard the news was not going to improve. They returned to the study together, And for the next 40 minutes, Harold Pierce walked Richard through exactly what Victoria had filed and exactly what it meant for his future, both personally and professionally. The surveillance evidence was damning, showing a clear pattern of deception that would be impossible to challenge successfully in any legal proceeding. The trust clause was ironclad, drafted by experienced attorneys decades earlier specifically to prevent the kind of legal challenges Richard's lawyers would naturally want to attempt. And most devastatingly, the timing of Victoria's filing, just minutes after the merger closed, meant that Richard's shares had reached their maximum value in the combined company before the forfeiture clause transferred them away from him, ensuring that the trust established for his daughter would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, while Richard himself retained only the smaller personal investments and assets that had not been part of the Sterling Dynamics ownership structure. Can we challenge the validity of the clause itself? Richard asked, grasping for any possible legal strategy that might reverse what had already happened. Pierce shook his head. We can try, but honestly, I've spent the past 2 hours reviewing the original trust document with 2 other attorneys, and we all agree the clause is legally sound. Your father had it drafted by one of the best trust attorneys in Connecticut, and you signed it voluntarily as an adult, which means you agreed to be bound by its terms. The only way to challenge it would be to prove the evidence Victoria submitted was somehow fabricated or obtained illegally, and from what I can see, everything she gathered would be admissible in court. She used a licensed private investigator, documented everything according to proper legal standards, and submitted it through the correct administrative channels. This wasn't a wife acting on emotion, Richard. This was an attorney executing a legal strategy she clearly spent months preparing. Richard sat in stunned silence as the full implications continued to settle over him. He had not just lost his company. He had lost it to his own wife, using a document he had signed himself, triggered by behavior she had documented so thoroughly that he had no legal defense against it. The merger he had worked 18 months to negotiate had closed successfully, but the wealth it created was now in a trust he could not access, controlled by a woman who apparently hated him enough to spend months quietly preparing his professional destruction without him noticing a single warning sign. It was, Richard realized with something approaching dark admiration, probably the most thoroughly executed revenge he had ever seen in his 30 years of business, and it had been executed by someone he had completely underestimated from the moment she had become quiet during her pregnancy. The party ended eventually, guests filtering out with promises to connect the following week about the integration plans for the newly merged company, unaware that the man they were saying goodbye to would not be involved in those integration plans at all. Amber was one of the last to leave, clearly expecting Richard to ask her to stay, confused when he simply kissed her forehead distractedly and told her he would call her tomorrow. Richard could not face telling her tonight that the future they had been imagining together, the life he had been planning to build with her once he finally asked Victoria for a divorce, had just evaporated completely because Victoria had asked for something far more devastating than a divorce. She had asked for his company, and the trust his father created had given it to her. Victoria never came to the party. Richard realized, sometime around midnight while sitting alone in his penthouse surrounded by empty champagne glasses and the remnants of a celebration that had become a disaster, that his wife had planned even that detail carefully. She had told him she would arrive late, after the initial group of guests, which had seemed reasonable enough when she mentioned it that afternoon. But of course she had never intended to come at all. She had spent the evening signing documents in Harold Whitfield's office, activating the forfeiture clause that would destroy everything Richard had spent his adult life building. And she had done it while he stood on his balcony, toasting a merger that had just made him wealthy on paper while making him powerless in reality. The following morning, Sterling Dynamics Board of Directors convened an emergency session. Richard was required to attend, though he was not required to be happy about it. Sitting at the conference table where he had once directed strategy sessions and merger negotiations, now waiting to be told what would happen to the company he no longer controlled. The board's decision was swift and, Richard had to admit, probably inevitable given the circumstances. They voted 8-2 to remove him from his position as chief executive officer, citing both the shareholder restructuring and the unresolved SEC inquiry into those offshore wire transfers that Victoria's investigator had uncovered months earlier. The transfers Richard had made, using corporate accounts to fund personal stock purchases timed suspiciously close to material announcements, had been flagged by federal investigators, and the board wanted to distance the company from him before the regulatory scrutiny became a full criminal investigation. Richard cleared out his office that same afternoon, boxing up 30 years of awards and photographs and documents that represented a career that had just ended in less time than it took to conduct a standard board meeting. Employees walked past his office door without making eye contact, clearly aware that something significant had happened, but unsure whether acknowledging it would make the situation more awkward for everyone involved. By 5 o'clock, Richard's name had been removed from the executive directory, his corporate email had been disabled, and his assistant had been reassigned to the incoming CEO, a professional manager the board recruited from outside the company specifically because he had no personal connection to Richard or the scandal surrounding his removal. News of Richard's departure spread quickly through financial media outlets, though the actual reasons remained vague in public reporting. Sterling Dynamics issued a brief statement citing internal restructuring and ongoing regulatory matters, language that protected the company's reputation while being technically accurate enough to satisfy disclosure requirements. But within Richard's business and social circles, the real story began emerging through whispers and speculation that gradually coalesced into something close to the truth. Richard Sterling had lost his company because of an affair with an employee, triggered by a trust clause his own father had created decades earlier, activated by a wife who had apparently been planning this outcome for months without anyone suspecting what she was doing. Amber Lane heard the full story 3 days after the party, when a colleague from Sterling Dynamics called to tell her that Richard had been removed as CEO and that her own position as vice president of marketing was being reevaluated by the new leadership team, which was corporate language for telling her to start looking for another job before she was formally terminated. Amber confronted Richard that same evening, arriving at his penthouse unannounced and demanding to know whether the rumors were true, whether he had actually lost the company, and if so, whether their relationship had been the reason for his downfall. Richard confirmed what she had already heard, explaining with exhausted honesty that his wife had legally taken control of Sterling Dynamics using a forfeiture clause triggered specifically by evidence of his affair with Amber. For the first time since their relationship began, Amber understood that her involvement with Richard had not simply complicated his personal life or created awkward workplace dynamics. It had directly caused the collapse of his entire professional empire. She had believed she was having an affair with one of the most powerful businessmen on the East Coast, someone who could help advance her career while offering her a lifestyle she had always wanted but never had access to before. Instead, she had been having an affair with a man who was about to lose everything that made him valuable to her, using evidence gathered by his wife, while Amber herself had been unknowingly cooperating with the same investigator who was building the case against them both. Diane Cross, the private investigator, would later confirm in a deposition related to the SEC investigation that she had interviewed Amber Lane months before the forfeiture filing, posing as a corporate recruiter and asking questions that Amber had answered honestly, never suspecting that the woman sitting across from her was actually gathering information for Richard's wife. Amber had described Richard's travel schedule, his work habits, even the details of several late-night strategy sessions that had actually been hotel meetings disguised as business discussions. She had, without realizing it, helped build the case that would eventually cost her both her relationship and her career. Whether Amber deserved sympathy for being manipulated by Victoria's investigation or simply experienced natural consequences of her own poor decisions remains something even people familiar with the case continue to debate. What is certain is that within 3 weeks of Richard's removal as CEO, Amber Lane had resigned from Sterling Dynamics under mounting pressure from the new leadership team, who made it clear that her continued employment was incompatible with the company's efforts to move past the scandal Richard's behavior had created. She relocated to California shortly afterward, taking a marketing position at a much smaller tech company, far removed from the corporate circles where her relationship with Richard had made her briefly famous for all the wrong reasons. Whether she and Richard maintained any contact after her departure remains private, though colleagues who spoke with Richard during this period described him as devastated not just by the loss of his company, but by the simultaneous loss of both the wife he had betrayed and the woman he had betrayed her with. Richard's life in the months following his removal became defined by legal proceedings that seemed designed to ensure he understood exactly how thoroughly he had lost. The SEC investigation into the offshore wire transfers continued for nearly 8 months, ultimately resulting in a settlement that required Richard to pay back the profits he had made from those suspicious stock purchases, plus substantial penalties, along with a lifetime ban from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company. He avoided criminal charges only by cooperating fully with investigators and essentially admitting that the transfers had been intended to circumvent securities regulations, though his attorneys managed to frame it as a failure of oversight rather than deliberate fraud. Victoria filed for divorce 2 months after activating the forfeiture clause, though by that point the divorce itself was almost anticlimactic compared to the financial and professional damage that had already occurred. Because the trust transfer had already stripped Richard of his controlling interest in Sterling Dynamics, the divorce settlement focused primarily on their personal assets rather than the company itself. Victoria retained their primary residence, several investment properties, and the majority of their liquid assets, while Richard kept a smaller portfolio that left him comfortable by most standards, but nowhere near the wealth he had possessed just months earlier. The divorce was finalized quietly, without the public spectacle that had surrounded other high-profile separations, largely because Victoria had no interest in further publicity and Richard had no leverage to demand anything different. Victoria gave birth to their daughter, Charlotte, 3 months after the divorce was finalized. Richard was not present for the birth, though Victoria did inform him after Charlotte was born, sending a brief message with a photograph and the basic details. Healthy girl, 7 pounds 4 ounces, named after Richard's grandmother at Victoria's insistence because, as she wrote in that message, "Your daughter deserves to know she comes from a family with a history worth remembering, even if her father forgot the values that history was supposed to teach." Richard kept that message, reading it repeatedly over the following weeks, trying to decide whether Victoria was offering him a small kindness by including him in that moment, or whether she was simply reminding him of everything he had lost through his own choices. As Charlotte grew older, Richard remained part of her life, though in a limited capacity defined by custody arrangements that gave Victoria primary physical custody while granting Richard regular visitation rights. Friends who saw them together during those visits described Richard as a changed man, quieter, less certain of himself, speaking to his daughter with a gentleness that seemed completely different from the commanding presence he had once projected in business settings. Whether Richard ever truly came to terms with how completely Victoria had outmaneuvered him, or whether some part of him remained bitter about the forfeiture clause that had destroyed his empire, is something only he could answer honestly. What observers noted was that he never spoke publicly about Victoria after the divorce, never gave interviews about what had happened, never tried to rehabilitate his reputation by claiming he had been treated unfairly by a system designed to punish men more harshly than women. Victoria, meanwhile, continued raising Charlotte largely outside public view, occasionally appearing at Sterling Dynamics board meetings in her capacity as trustee of Charlotte's shares, but otherwise living a notably private life far removed from the corporate spotlight. Under new professional management, Sterling Dynamics recovered from the scandals surrounding Richard's departure, completing the merger successfully and growing into exactly the type of company Richard had always envisioned, though now under leadership that implemented strict governance protocols designed specifically to prevent the kind of concentrated, unchecked authority that had allowed Richard's personal decisions to threaten the entire organization. By the time Charlotte turned 5, Sterling Dynamics had nearly tripled in value from where it had been the night of Richard's final celebration, making the trust established in her name worth well over $500 million. In one of the rare interviews Victoria agreed to give, years after everything had settled into a new normal, she was asked whether she had ever regretted the way she handled Richard's betrayal, whether she wished she had simply confronted him earlier or filed for divorce without activating the forfeiture clause that had caused such dramatic consequences. Victoria's response was characteristically precise. "I did what was necessary to protect my daughter's future from a man who had demonstrated through his actions that his word, his vows, and his legal obligations meant less to him than his own immediate desires. I don't regret protecting her. I regret that protection was necessary." The story of Richard and Victoria Sterling ultimately became something of a case study, taught in law schools as an example of how overlooked trust provisions can have devastating real-world consequences, and discussed in business ethics courses as a warning about the dangers of allowing personal behavior to compromise professional judgment. But beyond the academic analysis and the legal precedents, this story raises uncomfortable questions about power, control, and the assumptions we make about the people closest to us. Richard Sterling spent 30 years building a reputation as someone who could never be outmaneuvered in business. Yet the person who outmaneuvered him most completely was sitting across the dinner table from him for nearly a decade, quietly absorbing every detail he never imagined she was paying attention to. His greatest blind spot was not his affair with Amber Lane or even his questionable financial transfers. His greatest blind spot was his fundamental assumption that his wife, particularly after she stepped back from her legal career to focus on family and home, had somehow become less capable of strategic thinking than the attorney she had been when they first met. He confused her quietness with passivity, her patience with acceptance, and by the time he understood the difference, everything he owned had already been transferred out of his control. Victoria Sterling's story, meanwhile, raises different questions about the ethics of revenge disguised as legal strategy. Was she justified in waiting nearly a year before activating the forfeiture clause, continuing to live with Richard, and allowing him to believe their marriage was stable while she quietly built her case? Or should she have confronted him the moment she suspected his infidelity, giving him an opportunity to end the affair before it became the documented pattern that would eventually trigger his downfall? These questions don't have easy answers, and they likely depend entirely on which details of the story resonate most strongly with your own experiences and values. What we can say with certainty is that on the night Richard Sterling stood on his penthouse balcony, celebrating what he believed was the greatest achievement of his professional life, he was actually celebrating the final hours of the only life he had ever truly known. The champagne he raised in toast became a marker not of triumph, but of transition, the last moment before he would have to confront the consequences of choices he had convinced himself would never catch up with him. And standing somewhere across town, his pregnant wife was signing her name to a document that would ensure those consequences were exactly as severe as the legal system allowed, using tools Richard's own father had created decades earlier, because Walter Sterling understood something his son had forgotten. That trust, once broken, can never truly be rebuilt, but it can be converted into legal protection for the people who still deserve it. If this story affected you in any way, we want to hear from you in the comments below. Do you believe Victoria went too far? Or do you think she showed remarkable restraint given everything she uncovered? Do you think Amber Lane deserved sympathy as someone caught in a situation she never fully understood? Or do you think she simply experienced the natural consequences of her choices? And most importantly, ask yourself honestly, if you were in Victoria's position, would you have acted differently, or would you have done exactly what she did, methodically and without mercy? Thank you for staying with us through this story about empire, betrayal, and the woman who understood that patience is not the same thing as weakness. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most quietly devastating cases of corporate and marital consequences we've covered, please subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the moments when powerful people discover they were never quite as in control as they believed. Next week, we'll be covering an equally remarkable case involving a real estate mogul who discovered too late that the offshore accounts he thought were hidden from his wife had actually been under her control for years, a story with financial twists that even experienced forensic accountants found difficult to believe. Until then, remember, the most dangerous opponents are never the ones making the most noise. They're the ones watching quietly, taking notes, and waiting for exactly the right moment to act. Richard Sterling learned that lesson far too late. Don't make the same mistake.